In 1976, in a storage bay at Bapty Company's premises outside London, an armourer named Karl Schmidt pulled a German machine gun off a shelf and set it on the bench in front of him. The weapon was 122 centimeters long from muzzle to stock. It weighed 12.1 kilograms unloaded. The receiver had the tight machining tolerances of precision German manufacture: cold-blued steel, a perforated barrel jacket, a bolt carrier visible through the top of the receiver. Schmidt was preparing the weapon arsenal for George Lucas's science fiction film shooting at Elstree Studios, and the brief was unusual. They needed weapons that looked alien, but photographed like they had weight and history. Real objects. Objects that had been built to a purpose. Schmidt found a set of automotive wiper blades in the hardware supplies. He fastened them to the barrel. The production script would give that gun a new name: the DLT-19 Heavy Blaster Rifle. The prop tag said, "German surplus, minimally dressed." Before the month was out, it would be slung across the backs of stormtroopers on a desert planet in a galaxy far, far away. That single prop decision, that specific gun, those specific wiper blades, that specific armourer at that specific bench, is the key that unlocks the entire Imperial arsenal. The title says MG42s Everywhere, so a distinction needs stating right now. The MG34 and the MG42 aren't the same weapon. The MG42 is the machine gun the 20th century remembered. Introduced in 1942, it fired at 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, a rate so high that American and British military training manuals during World War II specifically taught soldiers to identify it by sound rather than sight, because the individual shots blended into a mechanical tearing noise at that cyclic rate. The MG42 was manufactured from stamped sheet metal and simplified components, making it faster to produce than anything that preceded it. It became so influential that the MG3, still in NATO service today, is a direct descendant. When most people picture a German machine gun, they are picturing the MG42. That's the cultural weight behind the name. The MG34 came 8 years earlier. It was Germany's first true general-purpose machine gun, the weapon the MG42 was specifically designed to replace. The MG34 used a rotating bolt rather than the MG42's roller-locked operating system. It had more machined components, demanded more trained personnel to maintain, and cost significantly more per unit to produce. Both weapons fired 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser from either belt or drum feed. Both served as Germany's primary infantry support weapon at different points in the war. The MG34 remained in production until 1945, despite the MG42's arrival, because its precision engineering had applications the cheaper stamped model couldn't fill. The MG42 is the famous name. The prop under the DLT-19 is the earlier, more precisely machined gun. Every weapon in this script will be called what it actually is. The core thesis, stated plainly: the Empire generated over 50 distinct, specialized Stormtrooper designations, the majority of which are functionally the same white-armored soldier standing in a different terrain type, carrying a slightly different weapon. Those weapons trace to real surplus firearms from World War II and the Cold War, modified in British prop rooms with hardware store components, bearing fictional designations that bear no resemblance to the physical reality underneath them. The MG34, sitting inside the DLT-19, isn't metaphorical. The Lewis gun, from 1915, standing in as a futuristic blaster on Tatooine, isn't artistic inspiration. These weapons were physically constructed from these guns. That layer of physical reality, hiding in plain sight across half a century of Star Wars, is what transforms a repetitive variant catalog into something worth examining in detail. Understanding why these specific weapons ended up in a galaxy far, far away requires understanding where George Lucas was working and who he was working with. Elstree Studios sits in Borehamwood, Hertfordshire, outside London. Filming there in 1976 placed Lucas's production inside the British film industry's established supply chain, a network of prop houses, armourers, and effects workshops built up over decades of wartime and post-war filmmaking. The dominant node in that chain, for weapons of any era, was Bapty Company. Bapty Company had been outfitting film, television, and theatrical productions with weapons for decades. Books covering production craft from this era are consistent on the operational reality. If a production needed a weapon, historic or modern, functional or decorative, the call went to Bapty. If you needed blanks to fire with it, and a licensed armorer cleared to handle it safely on set with non-specialist performers, you went to Bapty. The Cinema Alchemist, a book covering behind-the-scenes film craft of this era, documents how productions would break down their weapon requirements and hand them to Peter Bapty for a first assessment. Lucasfilm's team did exactly this, and Schmidt, Karl Schmidt, the Bapty armorer who built the original E-11 blasters, became the man whose hands shaped the Empire's arsenal. What Bapty had in 1976 was 30 years of accumulated post-war surplus. The war had ended in 1945. Military hardware had been demobilized, declared obsolete as doctrine and technology advanced, and filtered through deactivation processes into civilian prop supply chains. By 1976, British prop houses had been accumulating this material for 3 decades. The weapons weren't just inexpensive, they were physically irreplaceable in a way that mattered directly to Lucas's production. A deactivated Sterling or MG34 had the genuine weight, machined surface texture, and component dimensions of an actual manufactured weapon. A scratch-built fiberglass prop built to the same silhouette couldn't pass the close-up scrutiny of a 35mm lens, and it wouldn't behave correctly in an actor's hands, wouldn't balance right, wouldn't sit right in a holster, wouldn't move through a draw with the authority of a real object. Real weapons, even deactivated ones, moved like weapons. They photographed like weapons. Budget constrained and shooting in the only country with the prop supply chain to support this scale of production, Lucas got exactly the aesthetic he needed from exactly the inventory his armorer had available. The Sterling L2A3 submachine gun arrived at Schmidt's bench with a specific manufacturing history. George Patchett designed the weapon in 1944, during the final year of the war, as a replacement for the Sten gun that had served as the British Army's primary submachine gun since 1941. Sterling Armaments Company in Dagenham, Essex manufactured it. The British Army formally adopted it in 1953. The L2A3 designation indicates its service classification within the British military nomenclature system, and it remained the standard British infantry submachine gun until 1988. In 1976, the Sterling wasn't a relic. It was still in active service across the British Army. The weapon Schmidt pulled from the prop shelf and began modifying was the current issue standard sidearm of the armed forces of the country where the film was shooting. That fact makes the subsequent prop transformation more remarkable, not less. The Empire's iconic blaster was a contemporary military weapon in the year of the film's production, dressed up and pointed away from Earth. It was also, crucially, visually distinctive in a way that served the production. The Sterling is a compact weapon with a side-folding stock and a magazine that feeds horizontally from the left side of the receiver, sitting at a 90-degree angle to the bore. That silhouette, a gun with a sideways magazine, didn't match anything a general 1977 audience would have seen in a Western, a war film, or a television crime drama. It read as alien because it was unfamiliar. The prop team needed unfamiliar, and the Sterling's design delivered it. Schmidt's modifications for the E-11 blaster are among the most precisely documented prop fabrication records in the original trilogy. First, the tank scope. A World War II-era azimuth scope, a real functional piece of tank fire control equipment, identified in the prop-making community as an M38 or M19 style, was bent onto a metal strip and attached to the top of the Sterling's receiver, sitting above the ejection port. Propstore.com, during a later auction of an original E-11 prop, confirmed the scope as a real, functional azimuth tank scope, obtained directly from Schmidt, who had retained it after the production wrapped. The scope alone tells you what Bapty's stockroom contained. Not just small arms, but ancillary military hardware from half a dozen nations and 3 decades of European warfare, all catalogued and available. Second, T-track plastic strips, sourced from drawer runners available at B&Q, a British hardware retail chain, were cut to length and glued over the Sterling's barrel ventilation holes. The perforated barrel jacket is one of the Sterling's most visually characteristic features, and covering those holes dissolved the visual connection to any recognizable real weapon. Third, the 32-round side magazine was shortened to hold only 3 rounds, designed to photograph as an energy power pack rather than an ammunition box. A 3-round modified Sterling magazine, photographed from below against a white Stormtrooper glove, looks genuinely alien. The geometry works in a way that the full 32-round magazine wouldn't, because a full magazine's proportions are visually familiar even without knowing the specific weapon. Fourth, additional plastic components, including what prop community documentation identifies as a repurposed photocopier part, were added to the body to change the overall silhouette further. The total material cost of the modifications, hardware store runners, a tank scope, a shortened magazine, a photocopier part, was negligible. The gun was the value. The E-11 props built for A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back weren't deactivated display pieces. They were fully operational firearms loaded with blank cartridges. During the Death Star corridor sequences in A New Hope, 9mm casings are visibly ejecting from the weapons, not added in post-production, but physically launching out of the weapons in real time as Stormtrooper extras move through the corridors at Elstree. The Royal Armoury's blog, which holds original Star Wars blasters in their collection, confirms this explicitly. The blaster bolt effects are the only element added in post-production. Everything else, the mechanical cycling, the ejected brass, the recoil, happened live on set in 1976. Real guns, real blanks, real stormtroopers firing them in a real British studio. The energy bolts came later. By Return of the Jedi in 1983, production had moved away from original Sterlings. The replacement was MGC, Model Gun Corporation, replica Sterlings manufactured specifically for theatrical use, capable of cycling mechanically without firing. The transition made practical sense. The supply of suitable surplus Sterlings was aging, productions were growing in scale, and the safety overhead of live-firing props was considerable. When Rogue One went into production in 2016, the E-11 props were built from S&T airsoft versions of the Sterling L2A1, a closely related variant of the same weapon family, nearly identical externally to the L2A3, but manufactured 40 years later for a completely different market. Prop researchers tracking these variations have documented at least 8 distinct filming versions of the E-11 across the full production history, differing in scope type, wire routing, and surface component configuration. 8 distinct versions of a 1944 submachine gun dressed in hardware store modifications, each slightly different, each carrying the same fictional designation across 4 decades of production. The DH-17 blaster pistol, carried by rebel soldiers defending Princess Leia's Tantive 4 in A New Hope's opening sequence, is also built from a Sterling L2A3 submachine gun. Different barrel component, modified scope configuration, different surface dressing, but the same base weapon underneath. The stormtroopers boarding the rebel corvette were carrying Sterlings configured as E-11s. The rebel troopers defending it were carrying Sterlings configured as DH-17s. The Galactic Civil War, in physical prop terms, was 2 factions exchanging fire with different configurations of the same British infantry submachine gun. The irony extends across the full franchise. Jyn Erso's blaster throughout Rogue One is a German P-08 Luger, the German Army's standard sidearm from 1908 through much of World War II. Princess Leia's A New Hope blaster was built from a Russ Margolin .22 target pistol. Boba Fett's weapon is based on a Webley & Scott Mark I flare gun, a British naval and military signaling device pressed into service as the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter's sidearm. Han Solo's DL-44 heavy blaster pistol is a modified Mauser C-96 semi-automatic pistol, introduced in 1896, with over 1 million units produced during its manufacturing run. The C-96's integral box magazine, positioned forward of the trigger guard, gives it the elongated profile that defines Solo's silhouette. Cassian Andor's primary rifle uses an AR platform pattern. The Rebellion and the Empire both armed themselves from the same British stockroom, then pointed those weapons at each other for 3 films. The Imperial military generated over 50 official Stormtrooper designations, and the weapons' physical origins are the most interesting thing about them. The institutional classification system that produced those designations, though, that's where the comedy lives. Reading through the full Wikipedia catalog, a structural template becomes apparent almost immediately. Take a standard Stormtrooper. Identify an environmental or operational context. Attach that context as a prefix to the word trooper. Generate an article, a supply chain entry, a manufacturer listing, and an affiliation notation. File it under Imperial forces. The Sand Trooper operates in desert environments. The Snow Trooper operates in Arctic environments. The Swamp Trooper operates in swampy terrain. The Magma Trooper operates in volcanic environments. The Sea Trooper operates in maritime environments. The Aqua Trooper also operates in aquatic environments, a designation apparently distinct from the Sea Trooper, suggesting either that the Imperial military's classification architects drew a meaningful operational distinction between saltwater-adjacent and freshwater-adjacent deployments, or that 2 different writers created entries for the same general concept at different points in the franchise's publishing history, and nobody reconciled them. Both entries exist in the official catalog. Both describe a standard Stormtrooper equipped for wet environments. Both have their own Wikipedia articles, manufacturer listings, and stated Imperial affiliations. The Space Trooper handles zero-gravity operations in vacuum. The Jump Trooper uses a jetpack for limited aerial capability in atmosphered environments. Neither article acknowledges the other's existence, despite the Venn diagram of their operational requirements presumably overlapping in any tactical scenario that begins in space and ends on a planet. The Hazard Trooper handles atmospherically contaminated environments. The Cold Weather Assault Stormtrooper is categorically distinct from the Snow Trooper, despite both operating in sub-zero conditions. Different official designations, different articles, different manufacturer listings, the same fundamental thermal engineering problem addressed twice and filed separately. The ISB Stormtrooper serves the Imperial Security Bureau, the Empire's internal intelligence and law enforcement apparatus. It's, visually and operationally, a standard Stormtrooper working for a different department. The ISB Stormtrooper exists because the organization that terrorizes the Empire's own population apparently required its own soldier variant, filed under a different bureaucratic family than the organization that terrorizes the Empire's enemies. The Mimban Stormtrooper in Solo actually justifies its own existence. The muddy, rain-saturated campaign on Mimban required a rubber cape and heavily weathered, caked armor that standard-issue plastoid couldn't sustain through a day's combat operations. That is a genuine environmental equipment response. Most entries in the catalog can't make that claim. The Mimban Stormtrooper's rubber cape and the Aqua Trooper's Wikipedia article both exist. Only one of them reflects a genuine design decision. The First Order inherited this classification methodology wholesale and applied it to its own production. First Order Stormtrooper, First Order Snow Trooper, First Order Flame Trooper, First Order Heavy Gunner, First Order Riot Control Stormtrooper. The prefix changed, the formula didn't. An organization formed specifically to recapture the Empire's institutional philosophy apparently recaptured its HR department's job titling methodology with equal precision. The weapons those something troopers carry are the actual content of this catalog. The most archaeologically interesting loadout in the original trilogy belongs to the variant standing in the Tatooine desert in the first 20 minutes of A New Hope. Isaac Newton Lewis was an American Army officer whose reception at home established a particularly unlikely trajectory for his most significant invention. In 1911, the U.S. Army's Chief of Ordnance rejected Lewis's machine gun design. The rejection reportedly involved a personal dispute between Lewis and the chief, rather than a technical evaluation of the weapon's performance. Lewis went to Belgium. He demonstrated the weapon to the Belgian army in 1913 and received their endorsement. Within a year, the British War Office had picked it up for the Royal Flying Corps, and by the outbreak of the First World War, it had become one of Britain's primary light machine guns, deployed simultaneously as an infantry support weapon and as an aircraft gun, the same basic design serving both roles simultaneously. BSA in Birmingham manufactured over 100,000 Lewis guns during the war. It armed infantry sections in the trenches and pilots above the Western Front. The Lewis fires from a 47-round Pan magazine mounted horizontally on top of the receiver. That distinctive drum sitting flat above the action is the gun's most recognizable visual element. A gas tube running beneath the barrel operates a piston that cycles the action. The barrel sits inside a distinctive aluminum cooling shroud, a wide cylindrical housing designed to draw air through the barrel jacket under the gun's forward movement, cooling the barrel without requiring the operator to stop firing. Nothing else in the 20th century's firearms catalog looks quite like a Lewis gun with its magazine in place. For the T-21 light repeating blaster, the prop team removed the Pan magazine. Stripped of its most recognizable component, that horizontal drum sitting on top of the receiver, the Lewis's profile transforms entirely. The cooling shroud remains. The barrel gas tube remains. The bipod mount points remain. Without the magazine, what's left is a long, geometrically complex barrel assembly with features that read as futuristic hardware to an audience that has never seen a Lewis gun. The specific modification was minimal. Remove one component, and 60-plus years of technological distance between the audience and the weapon does the rest. The lead sand trooper in A New Hope's Tatooine sequence, the trooper who approaches near C-3PO and R2-D2 after the crashed escape pod, is carrying a 1915 British infantry weapon with its magazine removed. A gun that the United States Army rejected in 1911 became the light repeating blaster of a desert specialist on a fictional planet 66 years later. After World War II, MG34s were captured in substantial quantities by Allied forces and filtered through surplus channels across Europe over the following decades. British armory collecting in the post-war period was systematic. Deactivated MG34s and similar hardware moved through legitimate surplus markets as militaries modernized and cleared their warehouses. Bapty's stockroom by 1976 reflected 30 years of this accumulation. The specific MG34 Schmidt modified had been manufactured for a Wehrmacht that no longer existed and was resting in a Hertfordshire prop house waiting for a science fiction production to discover that its proportions looked futuristic enough for a different galaxy. Introduced in 1934 and adopted as the Wehrmacht's standard general-purpose machine gun in 1936, the MG34 served as the primary fire support weapon for German infantry through the opening years of World War II. It measured 1,219 millimeters end-to-end and fired 7.92 by 57 millimeter Mauser cartridges at between 800 and 900 rounds per minute from either a 75-round saddle drum or a 50-round metal belt. In the sustained fire role, it required a two-man crew, one operator to fire, one assistant to feed the belt. The bipod folded beneath the barrel for ground deployment. Its elongated receiver profile, designed to serve simultaneously as a light machine gun for moving infantry and a heavy machine gun on a tripod, is the feature that photographs so effectively at close range. It looks purposeful without looking familiar. The connection between the MG34 and the DLT-19 is confirmed by multiple independent sources. Prop artist Donnie Versiga states directly that the prop is a lightly modified World War II-era MG34 machine gun. The prop building community has reverse engineered the connection with sufficient dimensional precision that Denix, a Spanish replica manufacturer, produces a reproduction MG34, 120 centimeters long, 8 kilograms, constructed entirely in solid metal, sold specifically to DLT-19 builders as a directly compatible construction base. That commercial product exists because the prop research community confirmed the identification with enough precision to build a business around it. When a sand trooper in A New Hope lifts a DLT-19, they are lifting a 12-kilogram German general-purpose machine gun dressed in automotive hardware. The wiper blades weigh almost nothing. The gun weighs 12 kilograms. The RT-97C heavy blaster rifle used by Imperial forces during the Galactic Civil War, and later by Cara Dune in The Mandalorian, traces to the German MG-15. The MG-15 was designed in the early 1930s as an aircraft-mounted flexible defensive weapon for German bomber and reconnaissance crews. It fed from a distinctive saddle drum magazine mounted above the receiver and had a perforated barrel jacket for sustained fire cooling. When Luftwaffe crews found themselves fighting on the ground, the MG-15 was adapted for infantry use with modified mounts. Post-war examples filtered into surplus channels alongside the MG-34 stock. Another German aircraft weapon from the same manufacturing era, another distinctive magazine configuration, another Bapty stockroom item repurposed for a desert planet. The SE-14R light repeating blaster carries a more complicated physical history. It appears throughout the original trilogy era in the hands of Death Troopers, Imperial officers, and K-2SO in Rogue One. In Ahsoka, Night Troopers carry it as one of 3 primary weapons. The SE-14R is a compact, angular weapon with component geometry that strongly suggests a real manufactured mechanism underneath the surface dressing. One prop fabricator with commercial reproductions identifies the base as a Wrexham Favor submachine gun. Independent prop researchers have noted dimensional similarities to the German MP40. A dedicated identification thread in the prop community has been running for years without reaching a documented resolution. The SE-14R almost certainly has a real weapon underneath it. The component geometry makes a scratch build unlikely, but the specific identification hasn't been confirmed with the documentary certainty of the Sterling or MG-34 connections. The standard Imperial Stormtrooper, debuting in A New Hope, carries the Sterling L2A3 configured as an E11. That weapon is the baseline from which every variant either continues or departs. The standard Stormtrooper is the prefix formula's 0 case. No environmental modifier, no specialty designation, just the institutional default. The Sandtrooper carries both the MG34-based DLT-19 and the Lewis gun-based T-21, making it the only original trilogy variant whose confirmed prop archaeology spans 2 complete weapon identifications from 2 different nations and 2 different wars. A colored pauldron, white, orange, or black by rank, marks desert specialist status. A load-bearing equipment harness provides extended supply capacity for prolonged desert operations. In prop terms, the Sandtrooper is the most historically dense variant in the original trilogy. A WW-1 British infantry weapon and a WW-11 German general-purpose machine gun, both on the same trooper, both on the same Tunisian location shoot, both dressed up as hardware from a planet that has no relationship to any human military history. The Snowtrooper arrived with The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, and here, the functional requirement genuinely differentiates the design. The Snowtrooper's chest armor has a different construction profile than the standard plate, with a fabric undergarment visible beneath a lower-profile chest piece, and a fabric cape covering the lower body to reduce wind exposure. The helmet is fully enclosed with a narrower visor, minimizing exposed surface area in freezing conditions. These are functional engineering responses to environmental requirements, rather than cosmetic prefix formula variations. The E11 Sterling-based blaster remains the primary weapon. The Sterling's simple blowback mechanism was reliable in cold conditions, unlike more complex locking systems that can become sluggish with cold temperature lubricants. The Snowtrooper is among the original trilogy variants where a specific environmental requirement genuinely produced a distinct design response. The Scout Trooper, debuting in Return of the Jedi in 1983, operates speeder bikes in reconnaissance and pursuit roles. The armor is visibly lighter, smaller plates, more articulated joints, a different helmet configuration with better peripheral vision for high-speed vehicle operation through dense terrain. Reduced mass is a genuine tactical necessity when operating a fast vehicle. Every kilogram on the rider affects handling characteristics at the speeds the Endor forest chase requires. The weapon shifts to a lighter blaster pistol configuration, appropriate for a mobile operator whose primary mission is reconnaissance rather than fire support. The Shock Trooper, introduced in Revenge of the Sith in 2005, wears red accented armor and provides close personal protection for Emperor Palpatine. Red marks elite and ceremonial status in the Imperial color coding system, a design principle that turns out to be one of the more coherent, long-running decisions in the franchise's visual language. That red equals elite signal, established in 2005, runs consistently across every subsequent production. Red pauldrons on incinerator troopers in 2019, full crimson armor on Sith troopers in the same year, the Scarlet Royal Guard aesthetic informing elite Imperial variants across multiple creative teams and 17 years of production. An institution whose classification bureaucracy produced both the Aqua Trooper and the Sea Trooper still maintained a perfectly consistent color grammar from Revenge of the Sith through the Rise of Skywalker. Rogue One, in 2016, delivered the two most visually distinctive Imperial variants of the Disney era. The Death Trooper is the black armored elite unit attached to Imperial intelligence and senior directors including Orson Krennic. Black armor is the visual inverse of standard Stormtrooper white, and the distinction is operational. Death Troopers handle high-value intelligence operations, sensitive site exploitation, and asset protection rather than standard infantry combat. Their communications pass through scrambled vocalizers that render speech unintelligible to outside listeners, a detail that serves operational security for intelligence missions and simultaneously produces the uncanny, inhuman vocal presence they project on screen. In Andor, Death Troopers function as a threat indicator before a single weapon is raised. Their arrival signals the Empire's maximum enforcement response. That visual shorthand works because the design is distinctive enough to register its meaning in a single frame. The Shore Trooper, officially the Coastal Defender Stormtrooper, deploys on Scarif's beach facilities with lighter, more articulated tropical environment armor and thermal imploders for assault operations. It's the Sandtrooper formula applied to a coastline. Identify the terrain, adapt the armor marginally, file the designation. The Shore Trooper's legitimacy as a functionally distinct variant sits somewhere between the Snow Trooper's genuine cold-weather engineering and the Aqua Trooper's entirely bureaucratic existence. Solo, in 2018, added two variants whose functional rationales are among the most coherent in the modern era. The Range Trooper guards Imperial maglev Conveyex cargo trains through the mountain passes of Vandor. The operational requirement is specific: maintaining effective combat capability on a fast-moving, elevated metal platform in exposed, high-altitude, high-wind conditions. The Range Trooper's heavier, more enclosed armor addresses that environment, and the magnetic boot technology solves a genuine constraint that standard-issue boots can't, keeping the trooper attached to a moving metal surface at speed. The Patrol Trooper handles urban rapid response operations from patrol speeders in Imperial population centers. The armor is lighter and more maneuverable than standard, consistent with the requirements of pursuit and crowd management from a fast vehicle in confined urban space. The same tactical logic as the Scout Trooper's lighter configuration applied to a city environment. The Mandalorian, beginning in 2019, introduced two Imperial Remnant editions that are operationally coherent in ways much of the broader catalog isn't. The Incinerator Trooper appears in Chapter 8, Redemption, the first season's finale, carrying a WW Series flamethrower and wearing a red pauldron marking heavy weapons specialty. Flamethrower operation is a genuine military specialty with different safety handling, different tactical positioning, and different crew training from standard blaster infantry. The weapon produces direct fire effects in confined spaces and against fortified positions that blasters can't replicate, and the Mandalorian sequence, where a line of incinerator troopers advances on the compound, is one of the more effective uses of variant-specific equipment in the Disney-era productions. The weapon choice drives the tactical situation and produces a narrative problem that requires a specific solution. The Artillery Stormtrooper, appearing in Chapter 14, The Tragedy, during the second season, wears yellow pauldrons and operates mortars and crew-served weapons rather than individual blasters. Mortar operation is a distinct military specialty with different crew organization, different fire mission requirements, and different tactical positioning from infantry. Yellow marks artillery designation in the expanding Imperial color coding system, extending the visual grammar that began with Shock Trooper Red in 2005 and ran through Incinerator Trooper Red pauldrons in 2019, a color language that multiple creative teams maintained, sometimes inadvertently, across 15 years of production. The First Order arrives in The Force Awakens in 2015 with a Stormtrooper program that carries a different prop archaeology signature than the Imperial originals. The F-11D blaster rifle reads visually as a successor to the E-11. Similar elongated profile, similar angular stock geometry, similar overall proportions, clearly designed to communicate lineage from the original trilogy's primary weapon. The prop community notes that while the visual connection is clear, the underlying base components don't appear to use the sterling as their foundation. No confirmed real-world firearm has been documented as the F-11D's physical base with the same certainty as the original trilogy connections. If the F-11D is a purpose-manufactured or CNC-machined prop, rather than a modified surplus weapon, it marks a genuine transition point. The moment where World War II surplus-driven prop archaeology gives way to purpose-built props that look like evolved versions of the originals without being built from them. The SE-44C blaster pistol, the First Order Stormtrooper's sidearm, has a confirmed real-world base, a Glock pistol fitted with a carbine chassis system. The Glock was introduced in 1982 by Glock GmbH in Deutsch-Wagram, Austria, and became the dominant military and law enforcement sidearm across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, adopted by more military and police forces than any handgun design that preceded it. By 2015, the Glock wasn't a surplus item. The SE-44C is the point where Imperial prop archaeology crosses from World War II surplus and Cold War hardware into genuinely contemporary manufacturing. The original trilogy reached into a stockroom of surplus weapons from wars ended 3 decades earlier. The sequel trilogy reached into inventories of weapons in active worldwide production. The prop archaeology didn't stop. The era shifted. The First Order generated its own internal specialist designations following the Imperial template. The First Order Flame Trooper carries the D-93 Incinerator Flamethrower, a different physical configuration from the Imperial Incinerator Trooper's WW series weapon performing an identical tactical role. The First Order Heavy Gunner carries the FWMB-10 Repeating Blaster, a large, crew-served automatic weapon consistent with a Support Fire Specialist designation. No confirmed real-world firearm basis for the FWMB-10 has been established in prop research. The First Order Riot Control Stormtrooper is one of the more interesting functional variants in the modern catalog, precisely because its primary weapon isn't a weapon in the conventional sense. The Z6 Riot Control Baton, an energy-edged melee implement for crowd suppression and prisoner handling, replaces the blaster entirely for a trooper whose primary mission is force projection in populated areas without lethal escalation. The confrontation between Finn and a riot control stormtrooper at Maz Kanata's castle in The Force Awakens is one of the few variant-specific moments in the sequel trilogy where the particular equipment directly drives the fight scene's mechanics. The baton is why the fight looks the way it does. The Rise of Skywalker in 2019 added the Jet Trooper, rocket pack for aerial operations, first deployed on Pisana, and the Sith Trooper, the red-armored elite unit of the Sith Eternal on Exegol. Full red armor on the Sith Trooper represents the maximum intensity of the color coding signal that began with Shock Trooper red accents in 2005. The complete break from white armor signals organizational discontinuity directly. These aren't Imperial remnant forces, not First Order forces, but a separate army with a different command structure, and the design communicates that without requiring a line of dialogue. Ahsoka in 2023 introduced the most recent substantial addition to the catalog, the Night Trooper. Night Troopers serve Grand Admiral Thrawn as his garrison force on Peridia throughout the series. The official licensed product descriptions, appearing on Hot Toys collectible packaging, characterize them as featuring battle-worn armor and eerie undead vibes. That description is unusual for franchise marketing copy, because it accurately describes both the visual design brief and the in-universe reality simultaneously. The Night Troopers in Ahsoka have been killed, preserved, and reanimated through Night Sister magic, and their battered, deteriorating armor reflects exactly that origin. The production didn't design around the decay. The decay is the design. Their weapons are the E11 medium blaster rifle, the E11D blaster carbine, and the SE14R light repeating blaster. Two weapons with confirmed WWII surplus physical prop bases, and one whose real-world identification the prop research community is still working through. In 2023, 47 years after Karl Schmidt modified that Sterling at Elstree, the E11 is still the primary weapon of the Empire's latest variant. Dead stormtroopers carrying a 1944 submachine gun dressed in hardware store components. The franchise has been consistent about this in ways it hasn't always been consistent about anything else. Skeleton Crew, premiering on Disney Plus on December 2nd, 2024, exists within the same canon timeframe as Ahsoka. Specific new Stormtrooper variant contributions from that series haven't been documented with the same detail as the Night Trooper introduction. One identification remains genuinely open in the prop research community: the FN SCAR, Special Operations Forces Combat Assault Rifle, developed by FN Herstal of Belgium and adopted by U.S. Special Operations Command in the mid-2000s, has been identified by prop-focused viewers as appearing in modified form among the Disney-era productions. The SE-44C's Glock base establishes that post-Cold War contemporary firearms do appear in post-2015 production inventories, so the SCAR's modular design and distinctive receiver profile make it a plausible candidate for the same adaptation process.